people, he took the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant, and God commanded for you." And in the same way he sprinkled both the tent and all the vessels used in worship. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. Thus it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ had entered not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now appearing in the presence of God on our behalf. Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly as the high priest enters the holy places every year with blood not his own, for then he would have to suffer repeatedly since the foundations of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And just as it is important for man to die once, and then after that comes judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sins, but to save those who are eagerly awaiting for him. For since the law has but a shadow of good things to come, instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. Otherwise, would they not have to cease to be offered, since the worshippers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have any consciousness of sins. But in these sacrifices there is a reminder of sins every year, for it's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Consequently, when Christ came into the world, he said, "Sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. And burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure. Then I said, Behold, I have come to do your will, O God, as is written of me in the scroll of the book." When he said above, "You have neither desire nor take pleasure in sacrifices and offerings and burnt offerings and sin offerings. These are offered according to the law." Then he added, "Behold, I have come to do your will." He does away with the first in order to establish the second. And by that will we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. And every priest stands daily at his service, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices which can never take away sins. But when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sin, he sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time until his enemies should be made a footstool for his feet. For by a single offering he has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. So thank you. I appreciate your patience, the long reading. But looking at what's happening, that Christ is that great high priest, trying to urge a group of Hebrew Christians not to return, not to go back, not to return to those sacrifices under the Mosaical law. He's urging them to understand who Christ is. And I know doesn't necessarily seem a struggle for us. I've never been involved in sacrificing bulls and goats and thinking that my sins have been washed away by blood of bulls and goats. But are there other things that you think we run to? Are there things that we can turn back to? Y'all quiet. All right? Yeah. Hey, I spoke Sunday night about that very issue, the idea that we just turn back to a life that we were living before Christ, that we neglect that sacrifice. And it's the same thing that he's urging these Jewish Christians not to do, except they were going to convert back to a different form of religion. But he is telling them that Christ is the high priest, sitting at the right hand. It's interesting that after this that he's going to hit Jeremiah 31, beautiful verse, but there's a repetitive theme, and I hope you caught it: purification of the consciousness the certainty of our redemption. When you think about forgiveness of sins and think about the difference between an Old Testament forgiveness and a New Testament forgiveness, do you contemplate consciousness very often? I know we remember sometimes. Me and Roy were not specifically talking about things, but talking about issues of the past and how we could be, or really me, not so much. Roy's always been great. But what about our conscience? Without a clear conscience, what problem does that create for me in my relationship with God? Okay, sin against the conscience. We were talking a little bit about that today when we violate our conscience. That's right. So it was talking about 1 Corinthians and meat and.
It don't have to be something wrong. We can think it's wrong and violate our conscience.
All right.
By doing the thing that we think is bad.
Well, I've always, I guess, maybe wrestled a little bit with the idea that, and I am in no way saying that sins in the Old Testament were not forgiven and really forgotten. That I think that's the insinuation. But I always think about the idea that God, when talking about King David, he said he's a man after my own heart, but he put an exception in there, didn't he? And so God brought back up a sin that David had repented of. I've always thought that was interesting. Okay, sin had to be recognized, confessed. And if I'm not, and I may be mistaken, I have to go read the chronological order of it there. But I think that remark about David was after Nathan came to him, I think. Maybe I'm wrong. But God remembering no more. When God remembers things, what does God normally do? So what are some things you can think about Israel petition God to remember? All right, his promises. So they're over in Egypt and they're crying out, right? And God remembered his promises to Abraham. And what did God do when he remembered those things? Well, he took action. He starts moving to get them out of Israel. When God remembers things, he takes action. The Bible tells us that our sins, he removes them from us as far as the east is from the west. Remembers them no more. And that idea should bring us great peace in knowing that we're forgiven. And that God either will take no action on them, however you want to view that, or God doesn't even remember them at all. I think that's more implied. But however you view it, God, we're through Christ, in a relationship that is perfected through Christ. And we have access to the Father. I don't know if y'all remember, if y'all ever messed up as a kid. I stayed in trouble pretty regularly with my parents. And my dad was the enforcer, you might say. And sometimes had a shorter temper. Maybe I brought that out. But I can remember when I was in trouble, just that feeling that I had. Nothing was right in the house until you got that over with, right? And so with God, that's not our relationship. We can be forgiven, and it's forgotten, and that's through Christ. The conscience sake, it's repeated. The unprecedented access we have to God through Christ. So within this, let's just jump down to verse 8. This Jeremiah 31 is pretty instrumental. It is the longest Old Testament quote in the New Testament, to my knowledge. It says, "For he finds fault with them when he says, 'Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, for they did not continue in my covenant, and so I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I put my laws into their minds and write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people, and they shall not teach each one his neighbor, and they shall not teach each one his neighbor, and each one his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will be merciful toward their iniquities, and remember their sins no more. And so, in verse 9, for no concern, anybody got a different translation there? Or is that what everybody has? So think about it. When God is talking about Israel has violated that covenant and he showed them no concern, what do you hear in that?
You talking about the very last part of that?
Mm-hmm.
It says, I disregarded them.
All right, disregarded, neglected them, right? Paid no attention. Or if we neglect something, what normally happens to what we neglect? Falls into disrepair normally, or relationships we neglect will fall apart. So God showed no concern for them because they violated this covenant. They continually violated. You go through the minor prophets and even into the prophets, and you'll see that. He always is saying that. But he said, I'll put my law into their minds and write it on their hearts. And that's not a new promise. He had talked about that many times. But God's going to give some people a new heart. You can see in Exodus 6 and 7, Leviticus 26, over in Deuteronomy 30, where God has said multiple times that he's going to do that with them. But they were unable to keep this covenant. Now, was it the covenant's fault? No, it wasn't the covenant's fault. But the reminder of sin year after year. In our relationships, if we're reminded of our failures year after year, how well does that go for us? Now, I don't know about y'all, my wife forgets it. She'll never bring anything back up. That's true. She's back there. She's shaking her head like, oh, he mentioned my name. All right, but if that happens, it doesn't happen for me, but if that happens, how's that relationship look? It's under stress, isn't it? Yeah, it is. Sins, they were being reminded yearly of sins.
Well, in verse 7, when it says this covenant, it had fault. It didn't have fault. It fault in the people.
Okay.
It's never designed to take sin away completely.
Okay. So what was the purpose of the covenant?
It would take away sin for a year and then
Okay.
be remembered back.
Yeah. But the laws were designed to try to steer God's people to be holy, to do what God desired to be done, because God was holy. And so the covenant never was in place necessarily to forgive sins. It was to encourage people or have their actions be in keeping with what God said was holy. And he made allowances for sin, for forgiveness of sin, shall we say. And he says in verse 13, in speaking of the new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. This is a major theme within these chapters or within Hebrews. You know, sometimes we did a class on God of the covenant, and sometimes we need to be reminded of it. We are not, nor have we ever been under the old covenant. I don't believe I have any Jews in here, but it was for them and for their ancestors, and we've never, most of us are Gentile. We have never, I would make that assumption. We're not, but that one is obsolete. That's the one they're trying to run back to.
And it says here in verse 7 again,
Mm-hmm.
if the first covenant could have done what the second covenant done, there wouldn't be no second covenant.
That's right.
And that for me, or this verse kind of pulls it all together. Up to now, it's been a strong comparison about how great
Mm-hmm.
the law of Christ is and everything else. But now it's just kind of like you want to put it in front of your face.
That's right.
What you think you want to turn back to makes no sense because it's obsolete. It is not.
That's right. And even if it's not obsolete, it cannot do it. It can't do it. It can't do it. Yeah. Mhm.
You do that across the street. I mean, you can smell the teachers almost. I mean, it's just, you're assaulted
Yeah.
by memories and your physical senses. Well, in the Old Testament, when you were going up to Jerusalem,
Mm.
there was thousands of sheep and cattle and goats and chickens, and they were roasted. It's a lot like the barbecue downtown.
Mm.
So you had this sense of going to worship in Jerusalem up on top of the mountain there and be assaulted by food,
Mhm.
all right?
Yeah.
And the worship then was, it was physical almost. Now we got just great news, really.
Mhm. Yeah. And on top of the smell, we'll get hung. On top of the smell would have been the smell of blood, because the high priest was just really a butcher.
Smell
We
of
have blood in our
Yeah.
worship service too with the Lord's Supper every day or every week.
Yeah. Yeah, and the biggest thing through that, Steve, too, is as you're along that line of thinking, is we have access to God, where because I'm probably talked too long on some of it, we're getting closer in time, so I just say that with that access, the high priest was the only one. So Day of Atonement, he would make a prayer for himself and his family, the forgiveness of their sins, himself, his family, and the priesthood as a whole, and then the sins of the nation. He would lay his hands on the scapegoat, and they would confess their sins to the scapegoat, send that scapegoat out into the wilderness. They would slaughter the bull. He would go behind the curtain, and only the high priest, as we've read here, the only way he could get back there is carrying that blood. He couldn't just walk back there without the blood. It took the blood of that sacrifice that allowed him as well into the presence of God. That's where God sat sort of in that mercy seat, that's where they saw God's presence, which that's the same thing he told them. And then he would have to sprinkle blood on everything. Everything was purified by blood. And without the shedding of blood, there could be no forgiveness of sins.
Well, he came into God's presence representing us.
Mm-hmm.
But now in the new covenant, we can go behind the veil and talk to God.
That's right. That's right. There's another point I think is very important that in 8, it says in verse 3, for every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices, that is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. And so think about, how do you view Christ? Christ's work of atonement is complete. He has ascended to the Father's right side, but he is still offering something. What is he offering? What? All right. Forgiveness of sins, mediation. He is mediating between us and God. When you think of mediation, though, I think it's important not to see that as a negotiation. And so you might say Christ is agreeing that we're guilty, agreeing of what we deserve. That's the wrath of God. He's just telling God that, hey, I've taken that wrath. I am that sacrifice. But he is mediating for us now at that right hand. It's not like he's just sitting somewhere not active. He is mediating. He is working on our behalf. Chapter 9 with those those earthly holy place, that tabernacle, redemption through Christ's blood down there in verse 11, greater, more perfect tent. So Christ has entered into some place much better. Once for all into the holy place. He didn't enter because of the blood of bulls and goats. He entered because of his own blood. Superior, better. He's a better priest. He's in a better position. He is, I'm sorry, I can't read that myself. Better priest, position, and place. Jesus is superior. Jeremiah 31 is just interesting for me. I just threw that up there. 600 years before Christ is when Jeremiah spoke. And then also the days are coming, starting in that Jeremiah 31, realized by Hebrews 1:1 in these last days. And so that prophecy is being fulfilled. We talked Hebrews 8 through 13, sort of a springboard, leading us into the rest of the chapter. So superior sacrificed, superior sanctuary, he's in heaven, superior blood, it was Christ's blood, superior finality, once and for all. So they no longer have to worry about those sins just on a yearly basis. I'm going to have to start wearing my glasses. Israel is prohibited from entering the most holy place. We talked about that. All right, so he gets into a segment in 9 and toward the end of 9 and into the first part of 10 about the necessity of this new covenant. And so if we're not careful, we think that the new has come because it's, and it is it, as Steve said, we can gather here. We don't have to travel to a foreign place. We're not required to make that journey. I would argue we're required to make a journey and gather together, but the problem is a stain problem. It's a sin problem. And it's not that a new covenant was so more simplistic. It is easier, but that's not. The new covenant did not come because it was an easier way of doing business. It's because the old way couldn't get the stain out. And so thinking of a dishwasher, think about your favorite shirt. You get a stain on that shirt, you usually go down to the creek and wash it, but it's still dirty. You see a dishwasher, you buy one, you bring it in, it's automated, you throw your shirt in there, but when it comes out, it's still stained. It's not that the new's easier, it's that the old couldn't get rid of the stain. And so there had to be a new way of stain removal, sin removal.
When he went behind that into the most holy place, he's in the presence of God. If we could understand that when we come here to worship, we're invited back in the holy place, in the presence of God, to worship him.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. For contrast, Christ entered into a greater and more perfect tent in heaven, not on earth. Better sanctuary. His better offering atonement once for all. And so, again, thinking about that old way, he's trying to encourage these Hebrew Christians that Christ is better by means of his own blood. So that sanctification came through his own blood, and to effect an eternal redemption, a permanent purging of sin. So think about out of John, walking in the light, right, as he is in the light. That idea that we can be purified through Christ. Well, he goes through this segment and just quickly, a mediator of a new covenant. He gets into a section where you would think we're in a legal law office, where it says, for where their will, in verse 16, for where a will is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established, for a will takes effect only at death, since it's not enforced as long as the one who made it's alive. Therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. And I don't know if it's trying to say that the death of Christ was necessary for the inheritance, or that the blood, if you want to say the violent death of Christ, the cross, was necessary. I think is more that idea that it took that death to make that covenant. Okay. So think about the old covenant. If you think about the covenant at Sinai and how did they enter into that covenant, it took the slaughtering of bulls. They would cut them in half. They would put them half on each side, and then you had to walk between them. And so think about what you're walking through. It's going to be a mess. But the whole idea of the covenant was, if I don't keep my oath, then thus be to me as these bulls. And so we could enter into an agreement verbally but that covenant or that oath was not binding until we slaughtered those animals, we quartered them apart, and we walked between them. And then we made that, thus be to me. Let this be to me if I don't keep it. Think about Sinai. You'll miss it if you're reading some of that on the backside. I think it's maybe Exodus 21 in there somewhere, 22. But Moses did that, and the people did that. Moses slung blood on the people, on the book, the stones, and on the altar, and that was the covenant. And Christ.
Good point right there, because like you pass through those things, and that's going to happen to you if you break the thing. If we break this, we go to the cross.
That's right.
That's what we deserve.
Yep. Well, definitely, we deserve death. Absolutely. That's right. Yeah, and only through Christ's blood. In other words, it's not that Christ carried his blood into the heaven, but it was his sacrifice on the cross, that blood, if you want to say, that ran down to the ground, that we have mercy, we have grace and forgiveness. I hope that makes sense. But indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood. The same thing here. It took blood to purify us. So Christ, jump down there to 28. So Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with the sin, but to save those who are eagerly awaiting him. And so I think in our Christian circles, we talk about this judgment that's coming and the second coming, and that is true. As appointed a man wants to die, then the judgment. But Christ's work in coming back is not the judgment work. It's salvation, right? He's bringing those who are his with him. You're either with him or you're not. You've already been judged. In Christ, we've already been found innocent.
We think of it as a trial, but it's really the sentencing phase.
Yes.
We're in the
Yes.
trial phase right now.
That's right. But salvation, he's not coming back to this earth to deal with sin. He's already done that. He's already offered an atonement for sins to those who obey him. For since the law, in chapter 10, for since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. And he's arguing with them. Otherwise, if that was true, would they not have ceased to be offered, since the worshipers, having been cleansed, would no longer have any consciousness of sins? His argument there, if the new wouldn't have come if the old was working, but in those sacrifices there's a reminder of sins every year. And so Christ, being our great high priest, having come into, and he's likened him to that tabernacle and to what's happening during that day of atonement, that Christ has entered behind the curtain. He is seated at the Father's right hand. He has made atonement through his own blood, and he is mediating for us. And so Christ. When we think about Jesus, sometimes we get in a discussion about religion where we're saying, well, what must I do to be saved? There are some obedient things. We are saved through grace, through faith, by grace, by the work of Christ. That's how we're saved. Now, do we need to be obedient to the gospel, obedient to baptism, confession? Yes, but it's all about Jesus. And that's the argument this Hebrew writer is making to them. Any questions? I know I sort of ran through that pretty quick.
Maybe Christ is sitting there on God's right hand waiting for us to do our job.
Yeah,
Plant the seeds
yeah.
for it to be a big harvest.
Big harvest, there's no doubt. Our job is to scatter that seed, and God will give the increase. You go back into those arguments of work. You can't work enough to get to heaven, but if you don't work, you're not going to make it there, because our salvation, our work is evidence of our salvation. But anyway, thank y'all. Appreciate it. Have a great night.
She does, but she won't. I miss that. You got it.